King Tutankhamun was buried in a solid gold coffin that weighed over 100 kilos. But when the priests tried to close it, the lid didn't fit. They actually had to saw off the top of his feet just to make it shut. Even for a pharaoh, that's a rough way to start eternity. You know, the funny thing about the early 1900s? Everyone wanted a piece of Egypt. Not the people, not the land. No, the past. Archaeology back then was a mix of science and, well, chaos. Half treasure hunt, half research project. Rich Europeans showed up dressed like explorers, digging for fame and gold, while locals did the real back-breaking work under the sun. The desert wasn't quiet. It was buzzing with rivalry, politics, and the smell of money. And right in the middle of all that, a guy named Howard Carter. Not an aristocrat, not rich, just stubborn. He'd spent years digging holes that led nowhere, chasing rumors about lost tombs. Most men would have quit, but Carter had that dangerous kind of patience, the one that makes you believe that one more shovel might change everything. Thing is, archaeology isn't cheap. His sponsor, Lord Carnarvon, had been paying the bills for years, and patience wasn't exactly his strong suit. Imagine funding a project for a decade, and all you've got to show for it is sand. You'd be frustrated too. Carter knew he was running out of time and money. One more failure, and the dream was over. But he couldn't let it go. He believed one tomb, had slipped through time's fingers. The tomb of a forgotten boy pharaoh, Tutankhamun. Now, Tutankhamun wasn't a celebrity back then. In fact, barely anyone remembered him. He'd ruled as a child around 1330 BCE during one of Egypt's weirdest political moments. His father, Akhenaten, had thrown the country into chaos by ditching the old gods and forcing everyone to worship one, Aten, the sun disk. That move did not go down well. So when Tut took the throne at 9 years old, his job was basically to fix his dad's mess. The capital moved back to Thebes, the temples reopened, and Egypt started breathing again. Of course, he didn't do it alone. He had older advisors who made most of the calls, but he was still the pharaoh, still the symbol. His name meant living image of Amun. Fitting, right? The kid restored a god. He died around 18, no one knows exactly how. Accident, illness, maybe even palace politics. But after that, history kind of forgot him. No great wars, no giant monuments, no famous heirs. Just a small tomb somewhere in the Valley of the Kings, and silence for 3,000 years. Now here's the thing. Most royal tombs in that valley had been robbed centuries ago. Grave robbers weren't amateurs, they were organized. Guards, priests, even royal workers sometimes joined in. When times got hard, people took gold from the dead to feed the living. Every time someone broke in, they left chaos behind. Ripped linens, smashed jars, missing treasures. So the idea of finding an untouched royal tomb, that was like finding a winning lottery ticket buried in the desert. Everyone wanted it. No one believed it still existed. Carter did. He'd worked at Luxor and other big sites before, known for his careful hands and exact notes. No random treasure grabbing, just real archaeology. Still, after years of almosts and not quites, his partner Carnarvon was done waiting. He told Carter 1922 would be the last dig. One last chance. You can almost feel that pressure, right? Like your boss saying this is your final paycheck unless you find a miracle. And Carter said fine. One more season. One last shot. At that point, most experts believed every major tomb in the Valley of the Kings had already been found or looted. The place looked dead, just cliffs, heat, and disappointment. But Carter kept noticing something. Small huts from ancient workers, rubble no one bothered to check. He figured if there had been a tomb hidden underneath, the later construction might have covered it completely. So he picked a patch near the tomb of Ramses VI. a spot most archaeologists had written off. And right there, the stage was set. Years of rivalry, a forgotten boy king, a broke archaeologist, and one impatient patron, every piece in place. This was more than a hunt for gold. It was a clash between two worlds, people who saw ancient Egypt as a treasure chest and those who saw it as a library of human history. When Carter finally picked up his tools that last season, he wasn't just digging for Tutankhamun, he was digging for redemption, for proof that patience and respect could still beat greed and luck.
Because if he failed, Egypt's sand would bury more than a tomb. It would bury the last hope of finding an untouched window into a lost civilization. And if he succeeded, the world was about to meet a boy who refused to stay forgotten. You ever have one of those moments that starts ordinary, but ends up changing history? November 4th, 1922 was one of those days. Carter's team had been digging for weeks in the Valley of the Kings, tired, dusty, and just about ready to pack up. Then one worker's tool hit something solid. Not rock, not sand, something different. He brushes away the dirt, and there it was. A carved step. One step. That's all it took. Carter gets called over. He kneels down, takes one look, and his heart probably skipped a beat. Steps cut into the bedrock. Ancient steps. You can almost imagine him whispering, "This can't be real." Because nobody had found an untouched tomb in centuries. By the next day, the team cleared enough sand to reveal a sealed doorway marked with royal symbols. The plaster still intact, no signs of robbers. That's like finding a locked vault in a world where every vault's been broken into. News spread fast. Reporters, scholars, government officials, everybody wanted a piece of it. Egypt had just become the center of the world's attention. And this wasn't just another dig. This was history waking up after 3,000 years of silence. But of course, not everyone was thrilled. Some experts doubted there'd be anything inside worth the hype. Tutankhamun? That forgotten boy? Probably empty, they said. Yeah, famous last words. Because when Carter later peered through that tiny opening and saw a glint of gold, all the doubt evaporated faster than desert dew. Still, the discovery lit a fire under old tensions, scientific, political, even spiritual. See, Egypt at that time was caught between two worlds, European control and a growing push for independence. Carter's dig sat right in the middle of that tug of war. His sponsor, Lord Carnarvon, had a deal giving him legal rights to half the finds. Half! Imagine telling a newly independent country, "Yeah, thanks for your mummies, we'll take half your treasures." That didn't sit well. Egyptian officials, led by Pierre Lecow, pushed back hard. They argued these artifacts weren't just ancient, they were part of Egypt's soul. And that soul wasn't for sale.
Egyptian journalists were shut out completely. You can guess how that went down. Overnight, a dig site became a political battlefield. Meanwhile, Carter was stuck in the middle, trying to do real archaeology while everyone else fought over gold and headlines. He wanted precision, catalogue every item, photograph every angle. But with every new discovery, the pressure grew. The British wanted results. The Egyptians wanted justice. The newspapers wanted drama. And boy, did they get it. Because soon after, tragedy struck. Lord Carnarvon, the man who bankrolled the whole thing, died suddenly, weeks after the tomb was opened. Infection from a mosquito bite, they said. But the world didn't want science. It wanted mystery. The Pharaoh's curse. Headlines screamed it everywhere. Death comes to those who disturb the king. People believed it, even educated folks. You can't blame them, really. It made the story even bigger. Ancient gods, sacred vengeance. A rich man dead after touching the tomb. Perfect headline fuel. In reality, the curse was more human than mystical. Probably bacteria, stress, or just bad luck. But superstition spread faster than Carter could shut it down. Then came another layer of debate, moral even, religious. Some Muslim scholars spoke out, saying exhuming and displaying mummies disrespected the dead. And honestly, that question still hits today. Where's the line between discovery and desecration? Others, like later Egyptologists such as Zahi Hawass, argued that opening these tombs preserved their stories. We protect their memory. We don't steal it. It's a thin line. Dig too deep, and you honor the dead. Dig for fame, and you rob them again. But back in 1922, that line was getting blurrier by the day. Then came the decision that sealed it all. November 26th. Carter standing before the sealed door. He carves a tiny hole into the plaster, slides a candle in, and peers through the gap. His eyes adjust to the dark, and what he sees takes his breath away. Gold. Everywhere. Furniture, statues, chests, scattered like a frozen storm of treasure, untouched for 3,000 years. Lord Carnarvon, standing behind him, asks, "Can you see anything?" And Carter replies, the line that would echo forever, "Yes, wonderful things." That moment wasn't just history, it was history changing before their eyes. What came next was chaos and awe. Carter wanted to move carefully, methodically, documenting every item. But the world didn't care about patience. Reporters were begging for details. Museums were calling. Politicians were scheming. Egypt's buried past had become the world's most wanted story, and nobody could control it anymore.
Because once that candlelight hit gold, the age of quiet archaeology was over. From that moment on, discovery meant fame, fortune, and fire. And Carter? He was now walking a line between being the man who honored Egypt's dead and the one who woke them. Every great story's got a duo, and in this one, they couldn't be more different. On one side, Howard Carter, precise, stubborn, laser-focused, a man who'd rather lose sleep than skip a detail. On the other side, Lord Carnarvon, wealthy, charming, a little impatient, and definitely more used to hunting foxes than pharaohs. Together, they made history. But trust me, it wasn't always smooth sailing. Carter started out with nothing fancy. He wasn't born into privilege. As a teenager, he was sketching artifacts in the heat, learning every crack and symbol by hand. He built himself from the sand up. What drove him wasn't fame, it was obsession. Every tomb, every shard meant something. He wanted to understand Egypt, not just dig it up. Carnarvon, he was the opposite. Rich, restless, and looking for adventure after a bad car accident that forced him to slow down. Egypt gave him purpose, and honestly, bragging rights. He had the money, Carter had the brains. The deal was simple. Carnarvon would fund the digs, and Carter would find something worth talking about. But years went by with nothing to show. By 1921, Carnarvon had had enough. The desert eats patience fast. He told Carter, "One more season, and that's it." You can imagine the tension. For Carter, it wasn't just a job, it was his life's mission. For Carnarvon, it was an expensive gamble. Still, that strange mix, the scientist and the aristocrat, worked. Carter's discipline kept chaos in check. His sketches, his notes, his careful digging. That's why Tutankhamun's tomb survived untouched and documented in perfect detail. Without him, it could have been another looted mess. And then there's symbolism in that partnership. Science shaking hands with adventure. The steady mind meets the impatient heart. In a way, they represented their entire era, the clash between careful study and the colonial rush for discovery, between respect for the past and the hunger to own it. Carter even used a chisel his grandmother gave him to open the tomb. Think about that. Years of empire, politics, money, and the final touch came from a family gift.
Carnarvon's story ended not long after the tomb opened. His sudden death fed the curse rumors and made headlines that still echo a century later. Ironically, it turned him into part of the legend he helped uncover. Their partnership? Complicated, necessary, human. It gave the world one of its greatest discoveries, but also left behind a question we're still answering today. Who really gets to own the past? You ever walk into a room so still, it feels like even the air is holding its breath? That's what Howard Carter and his team stepped into when they cracked open Tutankhamun's tomb. The first time Carter peered through that tiny gap, candle trembling in his hand, Carnarvon asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter whispered back the line that would echo through history. "Yes, wonderful things." Now imagine this, he wasn't exaggerating. The antechamber was the first space they entered, a kind of royal waiting room to eternity. But it wasn't neat. It looked like the aftermath of a golden hurricane, everywhere, stacked high, tangled, spilling into one another. 700 objects in what Carter later called organized chaos. Boxes, vases, stools, footrests, chariots, baskets, statues. Gold shimmered under centuries of dust, catching that flicker of candlelight like tiny suns waking from sleep. At first glance, it looked like disorder, but to the Egyptians, even disorder had meaning. The objects weren't random, they were chosen, blessed, and placed with intention to accompany a king into forever. Every couch carved with animals, a lion, a cow, a hippopotamus, carried spiritual weight. These weren't decorations, they were guardians, symbols of power, fertility, and cosmic order. And the chariots, stacked, broken down, but clearly once shining, reminded anyone who saw them that this boy wasn't just a child buried young, he was a pharaoh, a warrior, a god on earth. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. A smaller doorway led to what Carter called the annex. If the antechamber was the face of glory, the annex was its whisper. This space was cramped, barely enough to move, yet inside were more than 2,000 items. Oils, perfumes, jars of wine, games, baskets, food. Every necessity, from fine linens to simple tools, carefully sealed away as if the king might wake up tomorrow and need breakfast. Think about that. A civilization so devoted to the idea of eternity that it packed everything a person might ever need, down to their favorite ointment. Even after death, luxury wasn't optional.
But none of those rooms compared to what waited at the heart of the tomb, the burial chamber. When Carter finally opened it, the sight stopped him cold. The walls were covered in golden scenes of gods and rituals, their paint still bright after 3,000 years, like the brush had only just dried. And in the center of the room stood a great box, a shrine within a shrine within a shrine. 4 of them, each nested inside the other like the world's most sacred puzzle. Every layer they opened revealed something more astonishing. On the outermost shrine, protective spells gleamed in blue hieroglyphs. Inside, another shrine, then another, until finally, after days of cautious work, they reached the trio of coffins. 2 wooden, gilded with gold. And at the center, the smallest, heaviest, and most breathtaking, a solid gold coffin weighing over 110 kilograms. Think about that. Solid gold. Crafted not for display, but to rest underground, unseen, for eternity. That's how serious they were about the afterlife. And then, the mummy itself. Tutankhamun. he wasn't just wrapped and left there. Every fold of linen, every amulet, every scarab placed among the wrappings carried meaning. A map of magic, layer by layer, meant to protect the king's spirit on his journey through the underworld. Over his face rested one of the most famous objects in the world, the funerary mask. 2 layers of gold, weighing nearly 25 pounds, inlaid with glass and gemstones, lapis lazuli, turquoise, carnelian. The colors weren't just for beauty, they represented life, death, protection, and power. The mask bore the face of Osiris, god of the dead, merged with Tutankhamun's own features. Across his brow, a cobra and a vulture, symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt, both kingdoms bound forever in his image. The mask's beard, a long braided strip of gold, stood for divine immortality. It's ironic that centuries later, when modern conservators accidentally broke it during reattachment, it reminded everyone just how fragile eternity can be when touched by human hands. Under those wrappings, Carter's team found treasures so intimate they almost felt intrusive to uncover. Gold jewelry, rings, daggers, miniature charms, even armor pieces. A dagger made of meteorite iron, literally forged from a star that fell from the sky. Every single piece had a story. Every scarab, every charm meant something. They weren't buried with wealth, they were buried with faith. Then there was the treasury. If the burial chamber was the king's throne room, the treasury was his vault. Around 5,000 objects filled it wall to wall.
A black jackal statue, Anubis, the god of embalming, crouched guard over the space, eyes watchful even after millennia. Beneath him, a chest holding 4 canopic jars, each topped with a divine head containing the king's organs, carefully preserved. Nearby lay 2 tiny coffins. Inside, heartbreak. 2 mummified stillborn daughters of Tutankhamun, wrapped with the same care as their father. The Egyptians didn't separate the sacred from the human. Even tragedy was part of eternity. There were also 34 statues, jars of wine, 36 of them, and 14 model boats, so the king could sail across the afterlife's waters just as he had the Nile. Everything, from massive shrines to small toys made of ivory, preserved like they'd been waiting for him to return. And somehow, it all lasted. The tomb's preservation was a miracle. The entrance had been sealed so tightly that for 3,000 years, no moisture, no thief, no air even, disturbed it. Other royal tombs had been looted long ago, their riches scattered or melted down, but Tutankhamun's lay hidden, quietly forgotten, buried under debris from another tomb. That's what saved it. Luck and sand. That stillness gave the modern world something no other discovery had ever offered, a complete snapshot of how the ancient Egyptians imagined eternity. But here's the thing, these objects weren't just fancy decorations, they were theology in gold and wood. Every single item told a piece of a belief system older than most nations. To the Egyptians, life and death weren't opposites. Death was a continuation, a journey. You packed your chariots, your furniture, your food, your jewelry, because you were going somewhere. They believed the spirit, the ka, needed nourishment and comfort. Magic spells written on walls and amulets protected the traveler through the dangerous underworld until they reached rebirth. The layers of coffins and shrines weren't just barriers, they were prayers in physical form. Even the mask itself wasn't meant to hide the king's face, it was meant to transform him into something divine. A man turning into a god. Carter's team spent nearly a decade cataloguing everything. The photographer, Harry Burton, documented each item exactly as it was found. Every chest, every scroll, every cracked jar. His black and white photos are haunting. They show gold and dust, beauty and decay, side by side. And yet, even as they worked, time started creeping in again. Human breath, flashbulbs, and footsteps, each one slowly awakening a tomb that had been asleep too long. By the 21st century, humidity and carbon dioxide from visitors began to damage the wall paintings.
Cracks spread, colors faded.
The same fascination that had preserved Tutankhamun in memory now threatened him in reality. That's when teams from the Getty Conservation Institute joined with Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities. It took 9 years to stabilize the tomb, cleaning pigments, repairing plaster, installing air filtration. The work reminded everyone that discovery is only half the story. The other half is responsibility. And while all this was happening, the outside world couldn't get enough. When the tomb was first revealed to the public, it became an instant global obsession. Egyptomania took over. Newspapers, magazines, fashion, film. Suddenly, everything had hieroglyphs, pyramids, and gold motifs. Western cities filled their museums with exhibitions. People lined up for hours just to glimpse a few of Tut's treasures. Tutankhamun became a celebrity 3,000 years after his death. His name was on everyone's lips, his mask printed on everything from perfume bottles to postcards. But fame has a strange way of rewriting stories. For the Egyptians of the time, the discovery wasn't just wonder, it was a reminder. Their ancestors' resting places were being opened by foreigners. Their heritage displayed abroad. National pride began to rise. Voices in Cairo and Luxor started asking, who owns this past? Who gets to tell this story? The excavation had started as a British-funded project under colonial oversight. Now Egypt itself was pushing back, demanding recognition, control, and ownership of its own history. The government began restricting artifact removal, insisting that treasures stay in Egypt. It wasn't just about Tutankhamun anymore. It was about reclaiming identity. Carter found himself caught in the middle. The discovery that had made him a hero also placed him at the center of a cultural tug-of-war. For all his meticulous work and genuine respect for Egyptian history, he still represented an age when Western powers dictated the terms. And yet, despite that tension, one truth stood out. Without Carter's obsession and Carnarvon's funding, Tutankhamun might still be buried in silence. Without Egypt's rediscovery of itself, his story might have stayed someone else's property. The world's fascination with the tomb sparked a broader conversation about preservation, respect, and shared heritage. The fun and games of treasure hunting were over. Now the world was watching, and Egypt wanted the pen back in its own hand. By the midpoint of this saga, the tomb seemed fully uncovered. Thousands of items catalogued, treasures displayed, stories told. The world thought the mystery was done.
But that was the illusion, the appearance of completion. The real work, the real questions, had only just begun. Because what happens when the greatest discovery of the century stops being a secret and becomes a spectacle? When a boy king becomes an icon, and an icon becomes a battleground between pride, profit, and preservation. That was the moment Tutankhamun stopped belonging to the sands and started belonging to the world. You'd think that after finding the most spectacular tomb in human history, things would get easier, right?
fame, success, validation, happily ever after. But for Howard Carter, it was the opposite. The deeper he dug into Tutankhamun's world, the more his own began to collapse. It started quietly, almost like a shadow growing behind the gold. Egypt had just gained partial independence in 1922, the same year Carter broke through that tomb wall, a coincidence too sharp to ignore. For decades, British archaeologists had roamed the sands with permits signed by foreign administrators, pocketing half the fines for Western museums. But now, Egyptians were saying enough. Their heritage, their kings, their story, it was theirs. So when the news of Tutankhamun's treasure exploded across the world, the Egyptian government wasn't just proud, it was protective. This wasn't a British triumph, it was an Egyptian one, and they wanted the world to know it. Carter, meanwhile, didn't see politics. He saw work, years of dusty patience, discipline, artistry. He'd earned this. But Egypt's Department of Antiquities, led by Pierre Lecoq, saw something different. A foreigner who'd uncovered their greatest national symbol under an old colonial contract. The tension between them grew day by day. What began as polite disagreement soon turned into open hostility. In 1924, Egypt made its boldest move yet. They posted armed guards at the tomb. Imagine that. The man who discovered the burial site could no longer freely enter it. Soldiers stood where workers once dug. Every step, every artifact, every photograph now watched. It was a new Egypt, asserting its voice. When the tomb reopened that year, it wasn't just an archaeological moment, it was political theatre. Crowds gathered, flags waved, speeches echoed. Egypt wasn't going to let its past be taken from it again. And in that heat, Carter stood apart, caught between admiration and resentment. Then something far darker swept in, the thing everyone remembers, even if they forget the rest, the curse of the pharaoh.
It started with a death. Lord Carnarvon, Carter's patron, died in April 1923, just months after the tomb was opened. A mosquito bite on his cheek had turned septic after he nicked it shaving. Infections spread fast. No antibiotics back then. Within weeks, he was gone. But the press didn't see a medical tragedy. They saw a headline: "Death comes to the man who disturbed the king. The pharaoh's curse strikes again." Every newspaper from London to New York ran with it. Some even claimed, absurdly, that at the very moment Carnarvon died, lights flickered across Cairo and his dog howled and dropped dead in England. It was nonsense, but it sold papers, and people wanted to believe it. For a public raised on mystery, colonial adventure, and superstition, the story of a divine curse felt too perfect to resist. The idea that Egypt's ancient gods were striking back at their tomb raiders, well, that was far more thrilling than infection and bad luck. Before long, everyone involved with the excavation became a target for rumor. "Who will die next?" reporters whispered. Every sniffle, every delay, every fainting worker was twisted into evidence that the tomb was haunted. Carter hated it. He was a rational man, an archaeologist, not a ghost hunter, but he couldn't stop it. The curse became bigger than the tomb itself. It made front-page news for years, fueled by Western imaginations that painted Egypt as exotic, dangerous, otherworldly. The irony was, while newspapers printed myths, Carter was knee-deep in something far scarier: real decay. The mummy itself had suffered under time's slow weight. When Carter's team examined Tutankhamun's remains, they found the body partially crushed, the skull displaced, resin fused to the coffin from ancient embalming oils. The wrappings had hardened like tar, the joints frozen.
It took hours just to free the body bit by bit from the resin that had essentially glued it in place. And that wasn't all. Exposure to air, for the first time in 3 millennia, unleashed invisible threats: moisture, mold. The team noticed discoloration on walls and objects. The tomb, once perfectly preserved, began reacting to its new environment: light, breath, heat. Every discovery risked destruction. Carter and his small crew had to improvise constantly. No advanced conservation methods, no climate control, no sterile labs, just brushes, tweezers, and nerves of steel. Each piece had to be documented, drawn, described, photographed, then carefully lifted, often after hours of stabilizing it. Harry Burton, the photographer, became the silent hero of that moment. His glass plate negatives, shot by candlelight and patience, captured every item exactly as it lay.
Without him, much of what we know of Tutankhamun's tomb would have vanished into rumor and retelling. But while the work inside the tomb was steady and sacred, everything outside was chaos. Without Carnarvon's money, the expedition teetered on the edge of collapse. His family inherited the rights and revenue disputes, and communication between them and Carter soured. Carnarvon's death didn't just end a friendship. It cut off the funding that had fueled the entire excavation. Egyptian authorities, seeing their chance, moved fast. They revoked Carter's excavation license after a disagreement about access and artifact handling. For months, work halted completely. The man who had made Egypt the center of the world's attention was now locked out of the tomb he'd given his life to find. In his journals, Carter's frustration bleeds through the ink. He writes of bureaucratic sabotage, of journalists twisting his words, of being portrayed as both hero and thief. To him, he wasn't stealing Egypt's heritage, he was saving it from decay. But that argument carried less and less weight as Egypt redefined itself after centuries of foreign control. By early 1925, things hit rock bottom. The tomb sat sealed once more. The treasures already removed were locked away. The press had moved on to new scandals, and Carter's name had begun to fade, from glory to controversy. Then, unexpectedly, a shift. Egypt's government changed hands, and the new administration reopened negotiations. Compromises were struck. Carter could resume work under tight supervision and full Egyptian ownership of all artifacts. It wasn't victory, but it was something. And so the digging began again. Slower this time, more cautious, more political. Behind every photograph, every catalogue entry, every press release lay an undercurrent of mistrust. Egypt wanted its sovereignty respected. Carter wanted his life's work completed. Both were right in their own ways. Both believed they were protecting history, but they were speaking two different languages, one of science, the other of pride. And all the while, the curse lived on. Tourists came from all over to peer into the Valley of the Kings, half hoping they'd glimpse some proof of supernatural vengeance. Egyptomania swept through Europe. Jewelry, fashion, film, all gleaming with stylized hieroglyphs and golden serpents. The West turned the sacred into spectacle, and Egypt's holy dead into decoration. For Egyptologists, it was maddening. Centuries of history flattened into novelty. But for Egypt itself, something powerful was happening beneath that surface fascination. A cultural awakening.
Egyptians were no longer content to see their ancestors' treasures housed in London or Paris. They wanted them home, in Cairo, in Luxor, where they belonged. Tutankhamun had become more than a boy king. He was a symbol of national rebirth. Even among scholars, debate grew about what Tutankhamun really represented. Was he a minor ruler who happened to be lucky in death? Or was his short reign more important than history had allowed? Under the shadow of his father, Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who worshipped one god, the boy king had quietly restored the old ways. Temples reopened, priests regained power. The chaos of Amarna's religious revolution faded. Tutankhamun, for all his youth, had steadied Egypt's identity. And maybe that's why his tomb, hidden and untouched, felt different, as if history itself had chosen to protect him. But for Carter, those lofty interpretations didn't matter much. He was exhausted. Years of strain, political fights, endless labeling and photography. It wore him down. The man who once spoke of wonderful things now spent more time arguing with ministers and journalists than studying the past. And then came the lowest point, April 1923. Carnarvon's death shook him to the core. They'd been partners, rivals, friends. Without Carnarvon, Carter was unmoored. The newspaper's obsession with the curse only deepened the wound. Every article seemed to twist the knife, turning tragedy into theater. He stopped writing for a while, stopped appearing in public. The excavation site sat silent. Egypt's desert winds swept across the valley, erasing footprints, filling trenches with sand again. For a man like Carter, driven by precision, control, and purpose, losing command over his life's greatest find felt unbearable. He considered leaving Egypt altogether. The world that had once hailed him as the greatest archaeologist alive now saw him as a relic of an old empire fading fast. But then, quietly, persistently, he returned. The work resumed, not with fanfare, but with the steady rhythm of a craftsman doing what he was born to do. He catalogued, he measured, he drew, piece by piece, object by object. Tutankhamun's world was recorded into existence. In those long, silent days inside the tomb, surrounded by gold and shadows, Carter seemed to find his peace again. He had lost his patron, his power, and maybe even his reputation, but not his devotion. The tomb became his refuge, the place where noise couldn't reach. Outside, Egypt was changing forever, reclaiming its story, shaping a future where its treasures stayed home. Inside, Carter continued the slow, reverent work that made that story possible in the first place.
Maybe that's the strange symmetry of it all. While the West chased the thrill of a curse, Egypt found its strength in rediscovery. And Howard Carter, alone among the statues and coffins, found something too. Not immortality, not glory, but understanding. That discovery doesn't glitter like gold. It's quieter, heavier, more human. The moment you realize the past isn't something you own, it's something you serve. You know, after all the chaos, the curse headlines, the fights with Egyptian officials, the loss of his closest ally, Howard Carter finally did something rare for a man like him. He slowed down. The dig had turned from triumph to battlefield. Newspapers were still printing ghost stories, politicians were arguing over ownership, and every scholar in Europe wanted a piece of Tutankhamun. But Carter, he began to look at it differently. For the first time, he wasn't just excavating a tomb. He was holding an entire civilization's memory in his hands. And that hit him hard. He started working quieter, steadier. Every item catalogued, every artifact photographed before a single brush of dust was moved. Harry Burton's lens became their time machine, freezing the tomb exactly as it had been for 3,000 years. It wasn't about gold anymore. It was about truth, about keeping faith with the boy king and the culture that had buried him. And here's the real shift. Carter began to listen. Egyptian scholars, museum officials, students, their voices were growing louder. They wanted ownership of their history, not just to watch it being shipped away. Slowly, Carter learned to share the stage. He began coordinating with Egyptian experts, realizing that the best way to preserve the past
was to let those who lived closest to it lead its future. The tomb's meaning had evolved too. It wasn't just a glittering mystery anymore, it was a mirror, reflecting power, religion, art, and the fragile link between the living and the dead. People saw Egypt's story, yes, but also humanity's, and that became Carter's quiet redemption. The man who once dug for glory ended up teaching the world a harder lesson, that discovery means nothing without respect, that to truly unearth the past, you have to protect it. It's been said that the past never really dies, it just waits for someone to uncover it.
And in the case of Tutankhamun, that truth couldn't be clearer. What began as a desperate dig in the desert turned into one of the most extraordinary second lives in history. After years, decades really, of dust, sweat, cataloguing, and controversy, the treasures of Tutankhamun finally left the Valley of the Kings and stepped into the light of the modern world. The work Carter began was continued by scholars, conservators, and Egyptian authorities who realized this wasn't just about one boy king anymore. It was about what he had come to represent: the survival of memory, the endurance of identity. When the artifacts were first gathered at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, they became an immediate magnet for visitors. But the real phenomenon began in the 1960s and 70s, when the treasures started traveling the world. The Treasures of Tutankhamun tour, kicking off in 1972, wasn't just an exhibition, it was a global event. From London to Los Angeles, people queued for hours just to stand a few feet away from objects that had once rested in a sealed chamber of silence for 3,000 years. More than 8 million visitors saw them. Some wept, some took photos. Everyone left changed. It wasn't only the gold that drew them, it was the feeling. The mask, the chariots, the beds carved with animal heads, it all seemed to whisper that ancient Egypt wasn't just a chapter in a textbook. It was alive, human, emotional. The exhibitions placed Tutankhamun alongside other figures of his dynasty: Hatshepsut, Amenhotep II, his great-grandparents Yuya and Tuyu, painting a wider picture of the world he inherited. Yet the most sacred items, the golden mask and the mummy, never left Egypt. They stayed home, untouchable, under Egypt's watchful eye. That decision mattered. It said, "These are ours. This is our story to tell." From there, Tutankhamun transformed again, no longer just a pharaoh, but a pop icon. They called him King Tut, and the world couldn't get enough. His face showed up in fashion, music, even television. Jewelries copied the motifs of his necklaces. Movie sets borrowed the geometry of his tomb walls. In 1978, comedian Steve Martin turned the craze into satire with his hit song King Tut, a tongue-in-cheek tribute that somehow managed to celebrate the same mystery it mocked. Egyptomania had become both serious scholarship and pop spectacle, a strange marriage of ancient reverence and modern entertainment. But beneath all the glitter, Tutankhamun was quietly transforming something deeper: archaeology itself.
Carter's work had shown just how fragile these remnants were, how easily the act of discovery could destroy what it sought to preserve. So later generations learned from his mistakes. By the late 20th century, archaeology was evolving. Gone were the days of reckless excavation and hurried export. Scientists now used CT scans and digital imaging instead of chisels. The boy king's own mummy was among the first to undergo such non-invasive analysis. When Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass led a modern investigation of the mummy, new truths surfaced. The scans revealed the damage that early handling had caused, but they also offered rare insights into Tutankhamun himself. His body told a story of frailty, a broken leg, a cleft palate, signs of genetic disorders
likely caused by royal inbreeding. He hadn't been murdered as earlier rumors claimed. He'd been a sickly child thrust into power, navigating a kingdom still recovering from the religious chaos of his father, Akhenaten. And yet, in death, Tutankhamun achieved what few kings ever could: immortality. The CT scans, DNA tests, and photographic archives became acts of resurrection, reassembling fragments of a life lost in time. Forensic artists even reconstructed his face, giving the world a glimpse of the teenager behind the mask. Suddenly, he wasn't just a symbol of gold and power. He was a boy again, a human being whose story outlasted empires. Each new wave of research deepened his legacy. Scholars now understood his reign as one of restoration. He brought Egypt back to stability after the heresy of the Amarna period, re-establishing the worship of Amun and traditional order. The inscriptions in his tomb door, once just decorative, read now as a declaration. Egypt had healed. Even today, scientists are still chasing the tomb's secrets. Some suspect there might be hidden chambers, perhaps even connected to Nefertiti, the enigmatic queen of the 18th dynasty. Radar scans and imaging surveys have sparked both excitement and skepticism, reminding everyone that Tutankhamun's story isn't finished yet. But what's perhaps most striking is how the boy king's discovery reshaped Egypt's place in the world. The tomb's fame inspired entire generations of Egyptians to study their own history. Universities began training local Egyptologists. Museums began hiring homegrown curators. The narrative shifted from Western explorers discovering Egypt to Egyptians reclaiming their heritage. Cultural sovereignty replaced colonial ownership. What was once seen as the spoils of empire became symbols of pride.
Even on the global stage, Tutankhamun became a kind of diplomat. His artifacts toured the world not as loot, but as ambassadors. Every exhibit, every moment when a visitor stood before that golden mask, reminded people that this was Egypt's story, shared but never surrendered. And behind all the public awe, deeper debates grew. What does it mean to own the past? Who decides where ancient remains belong? What's the ethical line between science and sanctity? Tutankhamun forced those questions into the heart of modern archaeology. His tomb had exposed not just treasures, but our own impulses, to possess, to profit, to interpret. Out of that tension came reform, new guidelines for excavation, preservation, and respectful collaboration with local communities. The lessons learned in that small, dusty chamber echoed across continents. Today, as Egypt marks more than a century since Carter first broke through that sealed doorway, the story continues to evolve. The Grand Egyptian Museum, rising on the Giza Plateau, now prepares to house Tutankhamun's entire collection, over 5,000 objects, together for the first time since antiquity. It's both a tribute and a homecoming. There, the boy king will rest, within sight of the pyramids that inspired his ancestors, under Egyptian skies that have watched over him since the beginning. And yet, even now, Tutankhamun's magic endures. His eyes, crafted in quartz and obsidian, still seem to follow you, as if aware of how far his story has traveled. From the flickering torchlight of 1922 to the soft museum glow of today, he remains a bridge between worlds, between the living and the dead, the ancient and the modern, the seeker and the sought. If you close your eyes, you can almost imagine Carter at the doorway again. The air is heavy, the candle trembles, And when he peers through the opening, someone behind him whispers, "Can you see anything?" Carter doesn't move. He just breathes out those 3 words that would echo forever. Yes, wonderful things. And that's really what this whole story has been about. Not just gold, not just discovery, but the wonder that binds us to the people who came before us. Tutankhamun's tomb reminds us that every artifact is a message from another time, and that sometimes, to understand where we're going, we have to kneel before what's been buried. So, when you think of the Boy King now, don't just picture the mask or the curse or the crowds. Picture a quiet chamber under the earth, sealed for 3,000 years, holding its breath until the world was ready to listen. Because in the end, that's Tutankhamun's real treasure, not the gold, but the story, the one that refuses to stay buried.